My name is Melissa. I walked into a bank to save my dying father, only to find out my husband had stolen everything I had. He told me it was for investment. In reality, he was erasing me from his life. I felt small. I felt stupid. I felt like I had nothing. But in my darkest moment, I found a secret left behind by my grandfather. A secret that turned me from a victim into the owner of my husband's entire empire. I'm sharing my story today on Mother's Story to remind you that even when you feel powerless, you are stronger than you think. If this message speaks to your heart, I would be so honored if you subscribe to our channel. Join our family, and let's watch the tables turn. The air inside the private wealth division of the First National Bank was not merely cool. It was chemically scrubbed of all human imperfection. It smelled of polished marble, old money, and the distinct metallic scent of silence. I stood before the mahogany counter, a monolith of intimidation designed to separate the truly affluent from the merely rich, clutching my alligator skin clutch so tightly my knuckles had turned the color of bone. I needed this transaction to be swift. In my mind, I was not standing on the plush Persian rug of a financial institution. I was still back in the antiseptic hallway of St. Jude's Hospital, listening to the frantic, weeping cadence of my mother's voice over the phone. My father, Walton, a man who had spent 40 years teaching history and never asking for a cent, was currently lying in a cardiac unit with a heart that was failing to keep time. The surgery required a deposit that exceeded my parents' life savings 3 times over. It was a sum that, in my world, the world of Johnson and the conglomerate, was negligible. It was the price of a mid-sized sedans, or perhaps 2 of the vintage watches Johnson kept in his winder. I slid my platinum card across the lacquered surface. It was a heavy slate-gray rectangle that usually commanded instant subservience. I waited for the teller, a young woman with a tight bun and eyes that had seen too many zeros, to process the transfer. I had already mentally calculated the fastest route back to the hospital, planning the comforting words I would say to my mother, Jane. I would be the savior today. I would prove that marrying into this dynasty had a purpose beyond gala dinners and ribbon cuttings. The silence stretched too long. It wasn't the rhythmic clicking of keys, it was a pause, a hesitation. When I looked up, the teller was not looking at her screen. She was looking at me. The professional mask had slipped, revealing something far worse than annoyance, pity. She blinked once slowly, as if trying to clear a smudge from her vision. Mrs. Melissa, she said, her voice dropping to a hush that screamed of discretion. I am afraid I cannot process this withdrawal. My confusion was a physical weight in my chest. Don't be ridiculous. It's a joint account. The limit is. I stopped, not wanting to say the number aloud. There is more than enough. The funds are there, ma'am, she corrected gently, turning the monitor slightly away as if shielding me from a gruesome sight. But your access has been revoked. As of this morning, your name is no longer associated with this account. It is now under a single signatory, Mr. Johnson. The world tilted on its axis. The marble floor seemed to sway beneath my heels. Revoked? That's impossible. It's a marital asset. We signed the papers together 5 years ago. I see the history here, she continued, her fingers dancing over the keyboard, perhaps looking for a glitch, a mistake, a salvation that didn't exist. But the authorization level was modified remotely. You have been removed as a beneficiary and a signatory. You have 0 access. 0. The number echoed in the cavernous ceiling. I stood there, wrapped in a coat that cost more than my father's car, realizing with a sick, cold dread that I couldn't even buy a bottle of water. I was a mannequin in a shop window, adorned in luxury but hollow on the inside. I muttered a nonsensical excuse, snatched my useless card back and turned on my heel. The walk to the glass doors felt like a march to the gallows. I could feel the eyes of the security guard, the other patrons, the very walls burning into my back. They knew. In the language of the ultra-rich, a declined card was not an error. It was an excommunication. The drive home was a blur of gray highway and white panic. I didn't go to the hospital. How could I? How could I look at my mother and tell her that the daughter who had married the heir to the empire couldn't save her own father? The shame was a corrosive acid in my throat. I drove the winding roads up to the estate, the iron gates swinging open with a slow, mocking grandeur. Our house loomed ahead, a sprawling neoclassical beast of stone and glass. It had always felt like a sanctuary. Today it looked like a fortress designed to keep people out or perhaps to keep a prisoner in. I found Johnson in the library. It was his sanctuary, a room of dark wood and leather bindings that smelled of cigars and self-importance. He was standing by the window, looking out over the manicured gardens, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. The late afternoon sun caught the gold of his cufflinks, fracturing the light into sharp, blinding prisms. He didn't turn when I entered. He knew my footsteps. He knew everything. Why? I asked. My voice was trembling, betraying the terror I tried so desperately to hide. I went to the bank, Johnson. For my father. The account. My name is gone. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the ice clinking softly against the glass, a sound of leisure that clashed violently with my internal screaming. He turned then, his face a mask of practiced calm. He looked at me not with anger, but with the benign condescension one might offer a confused child or a particularly slow spaniel. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice smooth, devoid of any jagged edges. "I was meaning to tell you about that tonight. It's a restructuring thing, darling." Restructuring. I stepped closer, my hands shaking. "You cut me off." I was standing there, Johnson, in front of the teller. "I couldn't pay for my father's deposit. Do you understand what you've done?" He sighed, a long, weary exhalation that suggested I was being incredibly tedious. He walked to his desk and set the glass down on a coaster, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the mahogany. "You're being dramatic, Melissa. It's unbecoming." I moved the liquid assets into a strategic offshore investment vehicle. The yield potential is astronomical, but the regulatory framework required a single primary holder for tax efficiency. It's complex finance. You wouldn't understand the nuances of international leverage. "I understand that I have no money," I snapped, the volume of my voice rising, bouncing off the shelves of unread books. "I understand that you humiliated me. Put my name back on the account. Right now." Johnson laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. He walked over to me, closing the distance, and placed a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, possessive, yet lacking any warmth. Melissa, don't worry your pretty little head about these things. The bills are paid, aren't they? The staff is paid. The pantry is full. You have everything you need." "I need autonomy," I whispered, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "You need to trust your husband," he corrected, his eyes narrowing slightly, the veneer of benevolence thinning just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "I am securing our future. Your father's little medical issue, we can discuss that later. I'll have my secretary look into a donation. But do not storm into my office and demand access to capital you did not earn and do not understand." He patted my cheek, 2 light taps, dismissive and final, then turned back to the window, dismissing me as effectively as he had dismissed me from the bank ledger. I stood there, frozen. The library felt suddenly airless. I looked at his back, the broad shoulders of a tailored suit, the confident posture of a man who owned the world. For 5 years, I had believed that his wealth was our shared shield against the hardships of life. I had believed that my role as the hostess, the peacemaker, the polished ornament on his arm, was an equal contribution to our partnership. But as I looked at him, sipping his drink while my father lay dying and my pride lay in tatters on the bank floor, the illusion shattered. The velvet curtain was ripped away. This was not a partnership. It never had been. The credit cards, the jewelry, the access, they were not gifts. They were allowances. They were revocable privileges granted by a master to a servant. I wasn't his wife, I was his dependent. And like a pet that had bitten the hand that fed it, I had just been disciplined. I backed out of the room, silence wrapping around me like a shroud. I didn't go to the bedroom to cry. I walked to the foyer and stared at my reflection in the gilded mirror. The woman staring back looked the same. Same perfect hair, same expensive dress. But behind the eyes, something had fractured. The innocence was bleeding out, leaving a cold, hard clarity in its wake. The investment was a lie. The restructuring was a cage. And I was trapped inside it, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a husband who viewed my existence as a line item he could edit at will. The dining room at the estate was a masterpiece of intimidation. A long table of polished mahogany stretched like a dark runway beneath a chandelier that dripped crystal tears. Tonight it was set for 4, though the distance between the chairs felt like miles. My in-laws, Edward and Mary, sat at either end, bookends of old money and steely resolve. Johnson sat to my right, the dutiful prince, already swirling a glass of deep red vintage that cost more than my parents' mortgage payments for a year. I took my seat, the silk of my dress rustling softly against the upholstery. My hands were folded in my lap, hidden beneath the table, fingernails digging into my palms to stop the trembling. I had spent the afternoon pacing my bedroom, oscillating between panic for my father and a cold, unfamiliar fury at my husband. But here, in this room, emotions were considered vulgar. Here we played the game. The merger with Kincaid Logistics is finally proceeding, Edward announced, slicing into his steak with surgical precision. He didn't look up. He addressed the room generally, assuming his words were the only ones that mattered. Their valuation was absurd, but we squeezed them on the supply chain leverage. Excellent work, father, Johnson replied, his voice smooth and admiring. I've already started the reallocation of their assets. We'll strip the non-core divisions by Q3. Ruthless, Mary said, raising her glass in a toast. Her eyes, sharp and predatory behind her rimless glasses, glittered with approval. Just like your grandfather. The weak must be pruned so the strong can flourish. I felt bile rise in my throat. They spoke of companies and people as if they were cattle to be slaughtered. My father was lying in a hospital bed, dependent on the charity of strangers because my husband had decided to restructure our lives without my consent. Speaking of assets, I ventured, my voice sounding small in the cavernous room. I cleared my throat, trying to inject some steel into it. Johnson mentioned some changes to our personal accounts. For investment purposes. The silence that followed was absolute. The clinking of silverware stopped. 3 pairs of eyes turned to me. Edward looked bored. Johnson looked annoyed. But Mary looked amused. Oh, Melissa, she said, her tone dripping with patronizing sweetness. Johnson told us. It's a brilliant move. Aggressive asset management is the only way to secure generational wealth in this economy. You should be thanking him. I would, I said, my voice shaking slightly, if I had been consulted. Or if I hadn't been humiliated at the bank today when I tried to help my father. Johnson sighed loudly, dropping his fork onto his plate with a clatter. We discussed this, Melissa. It's temporary. Your father will be fine. I sent a check an hour ago. It's handled. It's not about the check, Johnson, I insisted, surprising myself with the sharpness of my tone. It's about the fact that I had to find out from a bank teller that I have no access to my own life. Mary chuckled, a dry rasping sound. Your life? My dear, you married into this life. You don't manage it. You inhabit it. Leave the heavy lifting to the men who built it. But it's our joint savings, I pressed, desperate to make them understand, to make them see me as a person, not a prop. My grandmother's inheritance was in there too. A pittance, Edward grunted, finally looking at me. His eyes were cold, devoid of empathy. A drop in the bucket compared to what Johnson generates. Don't be petty, Melissa. It's unbecoming of a woman in your position. My position. The words hung in the air like a threat. What was my position? A decorative object? A broodmare for the next heir? A silent partner who was expected to remain silent? The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of financial jargon. They spoke of hostile takeovers, of liquidating subsidiaries, of cutting losses. I sat there, picking at my food, feeling increasingly invisible. I was a ghost at their feast, a spectator to their power. As the plates were cleared for dessert, a decadent chocolate mousse that looked too rich to eat, Johnson leaned over to Edward. He lowered his voice, assuming the clinking of spoons would mask his words. We need to finalize the liquidation of the liabilities before the fiscal year ends, he murmured. The auditors are getting restless. If we don't clean up the balance sheet, the IPO valuation will take a hit. Agreed, Edward nodded, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. Cut the dead weight. If it's not performing, it's a drag on the portfolio. Get it done, son. Don't worry, Johnson whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. I'm already drafting the separation agreements. It'll be clean. My blood ran cold. Separation agreements. Liabilities. Dead weight. They weren't talking about a subsidiary. They weren't talking about a factory or a warehouse. They were talking about me. I looked at Johnson, really looked at him. The handsome face I had fallen in love with now seemed like a mask. The charm was a tool. The affection was a strategy. He wasn't just hiding money. He was preparing to discard me. I was the liability. I was the non-performing asset that needed to be liquidated before the company went public, before his personal wealth skyrocketed into the billions. I felt a sudden suffocating pressure around my throat. I reached up, my fingers brushing against the cold, hard stones of the diamond necklace Johnson had given me for our anniversary. It was a stunning piece, heavy with carats and history. Everyone who saw it gasped in envy. But in that moment, sitting in the opulent dining room surrounded by people who viewed love as a transaction and marriage as a merger, I finally understood what it was. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a symbol of devotion. It was a collar. A jeweled, beautiful, expensive choke collar. And Johnson was holding the leash, ready to snap it whenever I became inconvenient. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Melissa?" Johnson asked, his brow furrowing in irritation. "Where are you going? We haven't had coffee." I'm not feeling well," I lied, clutching my clutch to my chest like a shield. "I need some air." "Sit down," Mary commanded, her voice like a whip crack. "It's rude to leave the table before the host." I looked at her, then at Edward, and finally at Johnson. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't care about being rude. I didn't care about the rules of their twisted game. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling but firm. I turned and walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the marble floor. I didn't stop until I reached the massive front doors and stepped out into the cool night air. I gasped, filling my lungs with oxygen, trying to scrub the scent of their greed from my skin. I looked back at the house, glowing like a beacon of wealth and power against the dark sky. It was a beautiful cage. But tonight, the door had been left slightly ajar. And for the first time, I wasn't just afraid. I was awake. I knew what I was to them now. A liability. Well, I thought, touching the cold diamonds at my throat, if I'm a liability, I'm going to be the most expensive one they've ever encountered. The lie was surprisingly easy to construct, mostly because Johnson had long ago ceased to view me as a complex creature capable of deceit. At the breakfast table, amidst the clinking of silver spoons against porcelain and the rustle of the Financial Times, I announced my intention to enroll in an intensive art history course. I framed it as a necessity for properly curating the West Wing renovation, a project he had vaguely authorized months ago to keep me occupied. He barely glanced up from the stock indices, waving a dismissive hand that granted permission not out of support, but out of relief that I would be busy, out of the way, and adhering to the stereotype of the bored, wealthy housewife. He did not notice the tremor in my hands as I poured his coffee, nor did he see the calculation behind my eyes. To him, I was merely updating my software as a decorative object. In reality, I was preparing for war. Once he left for the conglomerate's headquarters, a glass tower that pierced the skyline like a jagged shard, I retreated to the deepest recesses of my walk-in closet. Behind rows of designer gowns and shelves of unworn stilettos, tucked away inside a dusty box of winter boots, sat an ordinary shoebox. It was the only secret I had kept from Johnson in 5 years. Inside was not jewelry or love letters but cash. Bundles of it, smelling of old paper and lavender. My grandmother, a woman who had survived the Great Depression and never fully trusted banks, had pressed envelopes into my hands every birthday and Christmas until she passed. Mad money, she had called it. For a rainy day or a fast getaway. I had always laughed at her cynicism. Now, staring at the stacks of bills that represented the entirety of my liquid assets, I silently thanked her ghost. This was untraceable. This was freedom. I bypassed the luxury sedan Johnson had leased for me, knowing its GPS would track my movements to the meter. Instead, I called a standard taxi service from a burner phone I had purchased at a convenience store the day before. The driver took me away from the manicured lawns of our gated community and into the city's gray beating heart. Not the gleaming financial district where Johnson held court, but the grittier administrative blocks where real life happened in all its messy bureaucratic glory. The building was a nondescript brick structure sandwiched between a bail bondsman and a discount electronics store. The brass plaque by the door was tarnished, reading Vance and Associates. Family Law and Asset Recovery. There was no receptionist, no espresso machine, no plush waiting area. Just a narrow hallway that smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. Mr. Vance was nothing like the polished corporate sharks Johnson employed. He was a man composed of sharp angles and rumpled fabrics, sitting behind a desk buried under avalanches of paperwork. He didn't rise when I entered. He merely gestured to a wooden chair that looked as uncomfortable as I felt. I placed the shoebox on his desk. He opened it, his eyes scanning the cash with a practicing appraiser's detachment. He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't offer sympathy. He simply counted it, his fingers moving with the dexterity of a card shark. "This buys you 10 hours, he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that suggested a lifetime of delivering bad news. "And my advice? It doesn't buy you a shoulder to cry on." I told him everything. The blocked account, the shell companies, the overheard conversation about liquidating liabilities, the impending IPO. I spoke without tears, stripping the emotion from the narrative until only the cold, hard facts remained. When I finished, Vance leaned back, the springs of his chair groaning in protest. He studied me over the rim of his spectacles, not with the pity of the bank teller, but with the clinical assessment of a mechanic looking at a wrecked engine. "You are in a classic starve-out scenario," he explained, cutting through the social niceties I was accustomed to. "He controls the flow of capital. He controls the documentation. In a high-net-worth divorce, the law doesn't matter as much as the ledger. The spouse who controls the information wins. Right now, Mrs. Melissa, you are blind. You are walking into a minefield wearing a blindfold." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had come looking for a legal savior, someone to file a motion and restore my life. Instead, Vance was handing me a mirror. "I can file motions," he continued, anticipating my plea. "I can demand discovery. But by the time the courts force him to hand over the documents, he will have moved the assets 3 times. He'll bury the money in trusts in the Cook Islands or convert it into crypto assets you can't trace. If you want to survive this, you don't need a lawyer yet. You need to become a spy." He slid a heavy leather-bound book across the desk. It wasn't a legal text. It was a manual on forensic accounting and corporate fraud detection. "Go home," Vance commanded. "Play the part. Be the doting, oblivious wife. But while he sleeps, while he's at work, you find the paper trail. You learn how he moves the money. You don't just look for what's there. You look for what's missing." I returned to the estate with the heavy book concealed inside a tote bag emblazoned with the logo of the city's finest art museum. That night, Johnson asked perfunctorily about my first day of class. I lied with a fluidity that frightened me, describing a lecture on the brushstrokes of the Renaissance masters. He nodded, disinterested, and retreated to his study. I waited until the house was silent, until the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the climate control system. Then I began my real education. I turned the guest bedroom into my war room. I covered the desk with glossy coffee table books on Impressionism and Baroque sculpture, creating a visual shield for anyone who might glance in. But inside the dust jacket of the history of Venetian glass, I hid Vance's manual. I began to read. The language was dense, arid, and initially impenetrable. Terms like EBITDA, amortization, shell corporations, and layering swam before my eyes. But desperation is a potent teacher. I treated the numbers not as mathematics but as a narrative. I learned that money leaves tracks, like muddy footprints on a pristine floor. I learned that every inexplicable transfer, every vague consulting fee paid to a company with no website, was a sentence in the story of Johnson's betrayal. Night after night, while Johnson slept the sleep of the arrogant in the safe, I was awake. I studied bank statements I had filched from his trash, piecing together shredded documents with tape and tweezers. I cross-referenced dates on his calendar with withdrawals from the few subsidiary accounts I could still view. I wasn't looking for art. I was looking for patterns. I discovered that business trips to Zurich coincided perfectly with large capital outflows from the domestic accounts. I found recurring payments to a firm called Bluebird Holdings, that had no employees and a registered address that, upon a quick internet search, turned out to be a mailbox in a strip mall in Nevada. The fear that had paralyzed me at the bank began to recede, replaced by a cold, burning focus. I was no longer the victim. I was the hunter. Johnson thought he was living with a woman who cared about color palettes and fabric swatches. He didn't realize he was sleeping next to an auditor. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into my course, Johnson found me in the study, surrounded by open books. He picked up a volume on Michelangelo, flipping through the pages idly. "Learning a lot?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's good to have a hobby, Melissa. Keeps the mind active." I looked up at him, my finger resting on a page of the hidden ledger beneath the art book. I saw the condescension in his eyes, the absolute certainty that I was harmless. "Oh yes," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's fascinating, Johnson. You'd be surprised at how much detail you miss when you're just looking at the surface. It's all about the hidden layers." He patted my head and walked away, secure in his power. He didn't see the wolf in the room. He didn't see that the choke collar was gone, replaced by a magnifying glass. I watched him leave, and for the first time in weeks I didn't feel the urge to weep. I turned the page of the ledger, my pen hovering over a suspicious entry labeled Viridian licensing fees. I had found the thread. Now I was going to pull it until his entire tapestry unraveled. The rhythm of my life split into two distinct, contradictory tempos. By day, I was the polished socialite, attending charity luncheons and discussing the nuanced brushstrokes of the Baroque period with feigned enthusiasm. By night, I became a phantom in my own home, haunting the corridors of power Johnson had constructed. My art classes provided the perfect cover. I would leave the estate in the mid-morning, dressed in smart casuals that suggested a day of museum wandering, carrying a tote bag heavy with notebooks. But instead of the city's cultural district, I directed the taxi to the unremarkable brick building that housed Vance's office. There, surrounded by the smell of stale coffee and the hum of a cheap printer, I transformed. I wasn't just learning, I was dissecting. Vance had given me access to a secure terminal in his back room. It was here that I uploaded the digital crumbs I managed to steal from Johnson's life. Every receipt found in a coat pocket, every bank statement pulled from the recycling bin before the shredder could eat it, every password I guessed or glimpsed over his shoulder, it all went into the system. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming at first. Johnson's financial life was a labyrinth of holding companies, trusts, and LLCs, designed to obfuscate ownership and minimize tax liability. But as Vance had promised, money leaves tracks. And Johnson, in his arrogance, had gotten sloppy. He assumed no one was looking. One Tuesday, while Johnson was in Tokyo for a critical merger discussion, I made my move on his home office. I knew the cleaners came on Thursdays, and he wouldn't return until the weekend. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I slipped into the study, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't turn on the lights. Instead, I used a small, high-powered flashlight Vance had given me, its beam cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. I went straight for the filing cabinet behind the heavy oak desk. It was locked, of course, but I knew where he kept the key, taped under the bottom drawer of his humidor, a habit formed in college that he had never broken. The drawer slid open with a soft hiss. Inside were hanging folders meticulously labeled: estate planning, tax returns, investments. I bypassed these. They were too obvious. I went to the back, to a folder simply marked miscellaneous correspondence. It was thin, almost forgotten. But inside, tucked between old letters from his university alumni association, I found a series of bank transfer confirmations. They weren't from our joint account. They were from a corporate account I didn't recognize, routed through a bank in Luxembourg. I photographed them with my burner phone, my hands trembling. Then I found the Rosetta Stone. It was a single sheet of paper, a memorandum of understanding between Johnson's primary holding company and an entity called Azure Horizon Limited. The address for Azure Horizon was a P.O. box in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. The signatory on behalf of the company was not a stranger. It was not a random lawyer. It was Mary, his mother. I felt the blood drain from my face. I sat back on my heels, the flashlight beam wavering. Azure Horizon Limited. The name sounded like a vacation resort. In reality, it was a vault. I cross-referenced the dates on the transfer receipts with the dates of major withdrawals from our joint savings, the very savings I had been told were reallocated for higher yield. The amounts matched perfectly. $50,000 here. $120,000 there. A steady, systematic draining of our liquidity. He wasn't investing our money. He was laundering it. He was taking every cent we had built together, every bonus, every dividend, every gift, and funneling it into a black hole where I couldn't reach it. He was effectively stealing from his own marriage, transferring marital assets into a jurisdiction that didn't recognize my claim, under the legal protection of his mother. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just greed, it was malice. He was ensuring that when he finally discarded me, I wouldn't just be divorced, I would be destitute. I would be a beggar at the gates of the empire I had helped maintain. I spent the next 3 hours photographing every document in that folder. I found emails printed out and forgotten, instructions to his personal banker to accelerate the divestment process, and ensure the domestic accounts are lean by Q3. Q3. The third quarter. That was when the IPO was scheduled. That was his deadline. I realized then that I wasn't fighting a vague sense of unease. I was fighting a countdown. When I finally locked the cabinet and returned the key to its hiding place, the sun was beginning to bleed gray light through the curtains. I hadn't slept, but I felt strangely energized. The ambiguity was gone. The hope that this was all a misunderstanding had been incinerated in the beam of my flashlight. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. I sat at the island, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, the beauty of the morning starkly at odds with the ugliness I had just uncovered. Johnson called an hour later from Tokyo. His voice was tired, affectionate even. "Hey darling," he said. "Just checking in. How's the art history coming along? Learn anything interesting?" I took a sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding me. "Oh yes," I replied, my voice steady, betraying nothing. "I'm studying the Dutch masters now. It's fascinating how they use light and shadow to hide things in plain sight. You think you're looking at a bowl of fruit, but if you look closer, there's a rotting lemon in the corner. A symbol of decay." There was a pause on the line. "Sounds deep," he said, clearly bored. "Well, I have a meeting. I love you." "I love you too," I said. And as I hung up, I realized it was the first lie I had told him that didn't hurt. It was just a tactic. A necessary camouflage. I looked at the phone in my hand, then at the stack of digital photos waiting to be uploaded to Vance's secure server. Azure Horizon Ltd. I had a name. I had a location. And most importantly, I had proof. The rabbit hole went deeper than I thought, but I wasn't falling anymore. I was climbing down rung by rung into the dark. And I was bringing a light. The house was quiet, the staff dismissed for the weekend. Johnson was at a golf retreat with potential investors, leaving me alone with the ghosts of our marriage and the secrets hidden within the walls. I stood before the small, discreet safe embedded in the wall of his walk-in closet, concealed behind a row of bespoke suits. I had tried our anniversary. I had tried his birthday. I had even tried the date we met. All had failed, flashing a mocking red light. It was pathetic, really, how little I knew the man I shared a bed with. He didn't value sentiment. He valued achievement. I closed my eyes and thought back to the few times he had been truly, unreservedly happy. Not our wedding day. He had been stressed about the seating arrangements. Not our honeymoon. He had spent half of it on conference calls. No, his happiest moment was preserved in a framed newspaper clipping on his desk. The day his first independent venture hit the 7-figure mark. October 14, 2018. I punched in the numbers. 1-0-1-4-1-8. The mechanism word. A soft, mechanical sigh of surrender. The heavy steel door swung open. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I reached inside, bypassing the stacks of cash and the velvet pouches of watches. My fingers brushed against a thick manila envelope at the very back. It was unsealed. I pulled it out, the paper feeling heavy and ominous in my hands. I sat on the floor of the closet, surrounded by the smell of his cologne, cedar and ambition, and slid the contents out. It was a legal document. Petition for dissolution of marriage. My name was at the top. Melissa versus Johnson. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I just sat there frozen, as I read the sterile legal language that reduced 5 years of my life to a series of clauses and stipulations. The grounds were irreconcilable differences, but the financial appendix was the true brutality. It outlined a settlement that was insulting. A small lump sum, no alimony, and a complete waiver of any claim to the family business or future earnings. But it was the date that made my blood run cold. The petition wasn't dated for today. It was dated for 3 months from now. July 15th. I knew that date. It was burned into my memory because Johnson had been talking about it for months. It was 2 weeks after the scheduled initial public offering of the conglomerate. The pieces clicked together with the terrifying precision of a bear trap snapping shut. He wasn't just leaving me. He was timing it. If he divorced me now, before the IPO, the valuation of his shares would be part of the marital estate. I would be entitled to a portion of the pre-public offering stock, potentially worth millions. But if he waited until after the IPO, after the company had gone public and the shares were locked up in trusts and offshore accounts, he would be a billionaire. And I would be a footnote. He was planning to ride the wave of wealth alone, discarding me the moment he reached the summit. I was a booster rocket, meant to be jettisoned once the payload reached orbit. The realization washed over me, not hot and fiery but cold. Absolute zero. I looked at the date again. July 15th. It was a deadline. A termination date. The sadness I had been carrying, the grief for the marriage I thought I had, for the husband I thought loved me, evaporated. It was replaced by something harder, something diamond sharp. Rage. Not the screaming, plate-throwing kind of rage. That was for amateurs. This was the quiet, calculating rage of a woman who realizes she has been played for a fool. I carefully placed the documents back in the envelope, ensuring every crease was aligned exactly as I had found it. I put the envelope back in the safe, closed the door and spun the dial. I stood up and walked to the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked the same, but her eyes were different. They were no longer soft. They were predatory. July 15th, I whispered to my reflection. He had set the timeline. He had chosen the battlefield. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed I would wait quietly until the execution date. He assumed I was still the naive girl he had married, the one who didn't understand finance, who trusted him blindly. He was wrong. I wasn't just going to survive this divorce. I was going to rewrite it. I walked out of the closet, my steps silent on the plush carpet. I had 3 months. 3 months to unravel his scheme. 3 months to secure my future. 3 months to turn the hunter into the prey. The game was on. And unlike Johnson, I wasn't playing for money. I was playing for survival. The office of Mr. Vance was a graveyard of broken promises. A place where love was autopsied and divided into percentages. We had spent hours cataloging the minutiae of my existence, reducing 5 years of marriage to a spreadsheet of depreciation and loss. The air was thick with the dust of old files and the acrid scent of cheap coffee, a stark contrast to the lavender-infused atmosphere of the estate I was about to lose. "We need leverage, Melissa," Vance grunted, rubbing his temples as he stared at the bleak landscape of my financial insolvency. "The prenuptial agreement is ironclad regarding his family's pre-existing wealth. We need something you brought to the table. Something he didn't buy." I sat in the uncomfortable wooden chair, feeling the familiar weight of inadequacy settle in my chest. What had I brought? My youth? My social grace? My ability to host a dinner party for 50 without breaking a sweat? In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of Johnson, these were not assets. They were merely the expected functions of a trophy wife, depreciating daily. "I have nothing," I whispered, the admission tasting like ash. "I came with a suitcase of vintage clothes and a degree in literature. Johnson provided the rest." Vance sighed, the sound of a man watching a case crumble before it began. He began to close the thick file on his desk. "Think, Melissa. Any businesses? Any copyrights? Anything you signed over to him?" The question hung in the air, stirring a dormant memory. It wasn't a memory of Johnson, or the cold marble of the bank. It was a sensory memory, warm, earthy, and fragrant. I closed my eyes and suddenly, I wasn't in a lawyer's office. I was back in the greenhouse behind my grandfather's modest cottage, the air thick with the intoxicating scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp soil. There was the garden, I murmured more to myself than to Vance. Land? Vance asked, his pen hovering. No. A scent, I corrected. Before I met Johnson, I helped my grandfather, a botanist, refine a cold-press extraction method for organic oils. It was purely mechanical, no chemicals. We patented the process. I started a tiny LLC called Grandma's Garden to sell small batches at local markets. It was just a way to keep his memory alive after he passed. I remembered Johnson's reaction when he first saw my little bottles. He had laughed, a sound devoid of malice but full of patronizing amusement. "It's cute, darling," he had said, pinching my cheek. "But let me help you make it real." He had taken my cute hobby and injected it with corporate steroids. He rebranded it. He changed the packaging from rustic brown paper to sleek, emerald glass. He scaled the production from my kitchen table to a massive facility in the industrial district. He took it over, I told Vance, the bitterness seeping into my voice. He renamed it Viridian Essence. It's the conglomerate's luxury wellness division now. They sell it in 40 countries. Vance froze. The pen dropped from his hand, rolling across the desk with a hollow clatter. He looked at me, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. "Viridian Essence?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Melissa, do you have any idea what Viridian Essence is valued at?" I shook my head. "It's just a side project. Johnson always calls it my little perfume shop." "It is not a side project," Vance said, typing furiously on his keyboard. "It is the single highest performing subsidiary in their entire portfolio. It's the clean beauty anchor for their upcoming IPO. It accounts for nearly 60% of their liquid revenue growth last quarter. It is the golden goose." He spun the monitor around. Graphs and numbers flashed on the screen, a dizzying array of profits that I had never seen. My grandfather's humble invention, born from love and dirt, was fueling the private jets and the galas I was now being exiled from. "But I signed it over," I said, feeling the defeat wash over me again. "I must have. Johnson handles all the paperwork. He merged it years ago." "Did he?" Vance murmured, his eyes scanning a digital database of state business filings. "Let's see. Men like Johnson. They are brilliant at the big picture, Melissa, but they are often arrogant about the details, especially when they involve things they don't respect." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the clicking of Vance's mouse and the thudding of my own heart. I thought of my grandfather, a man with dirt under his fingernails and a heart full of kindness. Johnson had dismissed him as a peasant, just as he had dismissed me as a decoration. "Here it is," Vance said softly. "The original incorporation papers for Grandma's Garden LLC." He clicked open a document, then another. Then he began to laugh, a dry, rasping sound of disbelief. "He didn't do it," Vance said, looking up at me with a grin that was almost feral. "He never dissolved the original LLC. He simply created a licensing agreement between Grandma's Garden and the conglomerate. He treated it like a vendor relationship because he didn't want the hassle of absorbing a small-time entity onto his main books." "What does that mean?" I asked, daring to hope. "It means," Vance said, turning the screen toward me again, "that the intellectual property, the patent for the extraction method, the formula, the very soul of the product, is not owned by Johnson's empire." He pointed to a line at the bottom of the screen. "Owner/registrant, Melissa Walton. He controls the bottling plant," Vance explained, his voice trembling with excitement. "He owns the trucks, the marketing team, and the inventory. But the right to make the product, the exclusive license to use the patent, that belongs to you. And look at this clause here." He highlighted a paragraph in the dusting licensing agreement Johnson had likely drafted himself, assuming I would never read it. "Term, revocable by the licensor, Grandma's Garden LLC, with 30 days written notice." The world stopped. The humiliation of the bank, the cruelty of the dinner, the cold calculation of the divorce petition, it all receded, replaced by a surge of warmth that felt like a hug from the grave. Johnson had been so consumed by his own grandeur, so convinced of my stupidity, that he had built his entire castle on land he didn't own. He had viewed my business as a cute little toy, unworthy of the expensive legal fees required for a full acquisition. He had left the keys to the kingdom in my pocket, because he never imagined I would know how to use them. I reached out and touched the screen, tracing my maiden name. Tears pricked my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. My grandfather, I whispered, my voice choking. He's still protecting me. He's doing more than protecting you, Melissa, Vance said, leaning back and lacing his fingers behind his head. He just handed you a loaded gun. I sat back, the realization settling into my bones. Johnson was about to go public. He was about to sell shares to the world based on the profitability of Viridian Essence. And at any moment I could legally pull the plug. I could turn off the supply of the product that justified his billions. I wasn't the helpless wife anymore. I wasn't the liability. I was the landlord. And the rent was due. Draft the notice, I told Vance, my voice steady, ringing with a new terrifying power. But don't send it yet. We wait. For what? For the perfect moment, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. He wants a tragedy? I'll give him one. But first, let's let him think he's won. In that dingy office, amidst the smell of stale coffee, the ghost of my grandfather stood tall. The scent of jasmine seemed to drift through the air, sweet and deadly. The garden was no longer just a memory. It was a weapon. And I was finally ready to wield it. The transformation was immediate and absolute. I did not return to the estate as the woman who had wept in a lawyer's office or the ghost who had haunted the hallways at midnight. I returned as a reflection, a perfect mirror of Johnson's expectations. I became the silent partner, not in his business but in his delusion. For the next 3 weeks, I curated an atmosphere of suffocating domestic tranquility. I anticipated his needs before he articulated them, placing his scotch on the coaster the moment he walked through the door, adjusting his tie with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes but was bright enough to blind him. I played the role of the oblivious, contented wife with the dedication of a method actor. I asked no questions about the bank accounts. I made no mention of the investment strategy. I spoke only of trivialities, the upcoming gala, the flower arrangements for the foyer, the weather. Johnson's arrogance, fed by my submission, bloated like a tick. He ceased to guard his phone. He left files open on the dining table. He believed he had successfully broken me, that the restructuring conversation had cowed me into obedience. He didn't see the predator hiding behind the porcelain mask. The pivotal moment arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, 10 days before the IPO roadshow was set to begin. Johnson was in his study, surrounded by mountains of prospectuses and legal binders. The air smelled of stress and ozone. I entered softly, carrying a tray of coffee and a small stack of my own papers, documents Vance had prepared with surgical precision. Johnson, I murmured, setting the tray down on a coaster to avoid marring the mahogany. I know you're busy saving the empire, but the accountants for the garden thing sent over some annual renewal forms. They said you need to initial them as the head of the household for tax purposes. Something about spousal consent for my little hobby losses. He didn't even look up from his tablet. He was reviewing the S1 filing for the SEC, a document that falsely claimed full ownership of Viridian Essence. Just put it there, Melissa. He waved a hand dismissively. I don't have time for your gardening club paperwork. I know, I'm sorry. I apologized, my voice dripping with feigned incompetence. But they said if we don't sign, the LLC dissolves and it messes up our joint tax return. You know how much I hate the IRS. He groaned, snatched the pen from my hand, and pulled the papers toward him. He didn't read a single line. If he had, he would have seen that he was not signing a tax return. He was signing a spousal waiver of interest and an acknowledgement of separate property. By scribbling his signature at the bottom of the page, he was legally confirming that Grandma's Garden LLC, and by extension the patent for the formula, was my sole and separate property, distinct from the marital estate and the conglomerate. He signed his own death warrant with a flourish, eager to get back to his fraud. There, he snapped, shoving the papers back at me. Now go. I have a call with Hong Kong in 5 minutes. Thank you, darling, I whispered, clutching the signed documents to my chest like a holy relic. You're so good to me. I walked out of the study, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't go to the garden. I went straight to the safe in my dressing room, the one he didn't know the combination to, and locked the papers inside. The trap was sprung. He had just handed me the keys to the guillotine. The next morning, under the guise of visiting a spa, I drove to the outskirts of the city. The landscape shifted from manicured hedges and iron gates to cracked pavement and modest siding. My parents' house was small, a relic of a life built on honest labor and academic salaries, but it held a warmth the estate had never possessed. I found them in the kitchen. My father, Walton, was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, looking friendlier than I had ever seen him. His skin was the color of old parchment, translucent and fragile. My mother, Jane, was brewing tea, her movements slow and heavy with worry. When I entered, the silence in the room broke. Jane rushed to me, her hands fluttering over my face, tracing the hollows of my cheeks. "Melissa," she breathed, her eyes scanning me for injuries I couldn't show. "You look different. Pale. Like you're holding your breath." "I'm fine, Mom," I lied, hugging her tightly. The smell of her baking flour and soap almost broke me. "I'm just tired. The gala prep is exhausting." I pulled a chair next to my father. He took my hand, his grip weak but steady. "You don't have to carry the world, Lissy," he rasped. "We can manage without the surgery. We can sell the house." "No," I said sharply. The thought of them losing their home, the only place I had ever felt safe, because of Johnson's greed, was unacceptable. I reached into my purse and pulled out a cashier's check. It was for an amount that made my mother gasp. It wasn't from Johnson. It was a high-interest bridge loan Vance had secured from a private lender, using the projected settlement of my divorce as collateral. It was a gamble. If I lost against Johnson, I would be in debt for the rest of my life. I was betting my future on my ability to destroy my husband. "Take this," I said, pressing the check into Jane's trembling hands. "Schedule the surgery for next week. Get the best surgeon. Don't look at the cost." "Melissa," my father warned, his eyes narrowing. "Where did this come from? Did he give this to you?" "It doesn't matter where it came from," I said, my voice hardening. "It's ours. It's what you deserve." Jane looked at the check, then at me, tears spilling over her lashes. "But what about you? What is happening in that big house? We feel like we're losing you." I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles of my skirt. I walked to the window and looked out at the small, overgrown garden where my grandfather had taught me to graft roses. I thought of the man in the glass tower who believed he owned me. I thought of the papers locked in my safe. I thought of the date on the divorce petition. I turned back to them, and for the first time in months, I allowed a true smile to touch my lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a captain who spots land after a long dark storm. "You aren't losing me," I whispered, the promise hanging heavy in the air. "I'm just waking up." I kissed my father's forehead and squeezed my mother's shoulder. "Take the money," I said, moving toward the door. "Get healthy. You need to be strong for what happens next." "What happens next?" Jane asked, fear flickering in her eyes. I paused in the doorway, the silhouette of a dutiful daughter dissolving into the outline of an avenging angel. "Just wait a little longer," I said, my voice low and lethal. "The storm is coming. And this time we aren't going to be the ones who drown." The ballroom of the St. Regis was not merely decorated. It was weaponized with opulence. Every surface that could reflect light did so, creating a disorienting hall of mirrors composed of crystal chandeliers, polished silver, and the manicured teeth of the city's elite. The air was thin, recycled through vents that pumped in a subtle, customized fragrance, the signature top notes of viridian essence, sandalwood, and bergamot. The irony was suffocating. The very air the investors breathed was my intellectual property, stolen, bottled, and sprayed back into my face as a symbol of their triumph. I stood at the precipice of the grand staircase, my hand resting lightly on Johnson's tuxedoed arm. I was wearing a gown of liquid silver, a garment that cost more than the house I grew up in. It clung to my frame like a second skin, designed to catch every flashbulb, every hungry gaze. To the hundreds of photographers gathered at the base of the stairs, I was the perfect accessory to a billionaire's ascent. Silent, shimmering, and expensive. To Johnson, I was a trophy polish for exhibition. He tightened his grip on my waist, not in affection, but in a proprietary claim. I was part of the portfolio he was selling tonight. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding staccato rhythm, a lightning storm of artificial adoration. I smiled. It was a muscle memory, a practiced contortion of facial muscles that conveyed warmth while my eyes remained as cold as the diamonds at my throat. Inside the fortress of my mind, I was checking a different kind of inventory. The cease and desist order was printed on heavy bond paper, resting in a briefcase that Mr. Vance would carry into the boardroom at 9 a.m. sharp. The affidavit of ownership was notarized. The trap was not just set, the jaws were already closing. Johnson just hadn't felt the bite yet. We descended into the shark tank. Johnson worked the room with the fluid grace of an apex predator, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, his laugh booming over the string quartet. He introduced me to hedge fund managers and venture capitalists as his muse, his rock. They looked at me with glazed eyes, seeing only a decorative object, a woman who existed to make the man look stable and family-oriented. I played the part flawlessly, nodding at their banal compliments, accepting their champagne, allowing them to believe that I was nothing more than the beautiful, vacuous wife of a genius. Mary and Edward held court near the ice sculpture, a grotesque carving of the conglomerate's logo. Mary, draped in emerald velvet, looked at me with a gaze that dissected my worth. She leaned in, her perfume clashing with the scent of the room. She touched my arm with a hand that felt like a claw sheathed in silk. She whispered that I looked adequate, that I had finally learned how to support the family properly. Her arrogance was a physical thing, a force field of entitlement. She believed she had one. She believed the restructuring had stripped me of my power, leaving me dependent on their benevolence. She had no idea that the ground beneath her bespoke heels was made of paper, paper I was about to burn. The evening crescendoed toward the speeches. The lights dimmed, focusing a single harsh spotlight on the podium. Johnson took the stage first, his charisma radiating like heat. He spoke of innovation, of legacy, of the relentless pursuit of excellence. He projected charts and graphs behind him, jagged lines of profit climbing toward the heavens. The investors murmured in approval. They saw billions. I saw theft. Then Edward took the microphone. The patriarch, the architect of the empire. He looked older under the harsh light, his skin papery, but his voice was still a boom of authority. He raised a flute of vintage Krug, the bubbles rising in a golden chain. He spoke of the conglomerate's history, of the grit it took to build a dynasty. And then he turned his attention to the crown jewel. He spoke of Viridian essence. He called it the engine of our future, the alchemical miracle that would redefine the luxury wellness market. He praised Johnson for his vision in acquiring and scaling the brand. He toasted to the IPO, to the wealth it would generate, to the complete dominance of the market. To Viridian, Edward bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. And to the family that built it. The room erupted. Glasses clinked. 1,000 voices murmured assent. Johnson beamed, lifting his glass to his father, then to the crowd, and finally, with a smug, self-satisfied nod, to me. I raised my glass. The crystal was cold against my fingertips. I looked across the sea of tuxedos and gowns, locking eyes with Johnson. He saw a wife saluting her husband's victory. He saw submission. But as I tilted the glass, I didn't drink to his success. I drank to his ruin. Enjoy it while you can, old man, I thought, the words ringing clear and sharp in the silence of my head. You're drinking from my cup. You are toasting a ghost. The miracle you are selling belongs to the girl you tried to erase. I took a sip. The champagne tasted like vengeance, crisp, dry, and intoxicating. I lowered the glass and offered Johnson one last, dazzling smile. It was the smile of the executioner before the blade drops. The cameras flashed one final time, capturing the moment. The happy couple, the proud parents, the empire at its zenith. Tomorrow the photos would be in every financial paper. But the caption would be wrong. This wasn't a coronation. It was a funeral. And I was the only one in the room who knew where the body was buried. The gala wound down, the guests spilling out into the night, drunk on potential profits. Johnson was euphoric in the limousine ride home. He talked about the opening bell, about the stock price, about the yacht he planned to buy. I listened, nodding at the appropriate intervals, my hands folded demurely in my lap. I felt a strange sense of peace. The fear was gone. The sadness was gone. There was only the countdown. We arrived at the estate. Johnson went straight to bed, collapsing into a sleep born of supreme confidence. I stayed up. I sat by the window in the guest room, watching the moon trace a silver path across the floor. I watched the digital clock on the nightstand flip the numbers, minute by minute, marching inexorably toward morning. 9 a.m. The market would open. The board would convene. And the butterfly would finally break the wheel. I closed my eyes not to sleep but to visualize the fall. It would be elegant. It would be absolute. The night was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath. The silence of a fuse burning down to the powder keg. I waited for the dawn, ready to strike the match. I dressed for the execution in white. Not the soft bridal ivory of submission, but a stark blinding alabaster. A suit tailored to look less like clothing and more like armor. I fastened the diamond necklace around my throat, the cold stones resting against my pulse, no longer a collar but a trophy of war. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized. Eyes devoid of mercy, posture rigid with purpose. I was no longer Melissa, the decorative wife. I was the impending correction in the market. The drive to the conglomerate's headquarters was a silent procession. Beside me sat Mr. Vance, looking less like a rumpled strip mall lawyer, and more like a reaper in a charcoal suit. On his lap rested a leather briefcase, heavy not with gold but with paper, the deadliest weapon in the modern world. We didn't speak. The air in the car was thick with the static of anticipation. We were two saboteurs approaching the Citadel gates, armed with a match for a fuse that had been burning for months. The glass tower pierced the morning sky, a monument to Johnson's ego. Security in the lobby nodded at me with practiced deference, accustomed to the docile wife who occasionally brought lunch. They swiped me through the turnstiles, unaware they were granting access to the virus that would crash the system. We took the private elevator, the numbers climbing steadily toward the penthouse boardroom. 40, 50, 60. With every floor, the pressure in my ears popped, acclimating to the altitude where oxygen was scarce and empathy was non-existent. The double doors to the boardroom were closed. Inside, I knew the high priests of finance were gathered. Johnson, Edward, Mary, the underwriters, the key investors, all waiting for the opening bell to ring, for the ticker symbol to flash, for their net worth to multiply into the stratosphere. They were popping champagne on the deck of the Titanic, oblivious to the iceberg sitting in the lobby. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with a shove that required both hands, the sound of their impact against the interior walls echoing like a gunshot. The conversation inside died instantly. 20 heads turned. The tableau was almost comical. Johnson stood near the window, a glass of mimosa halfway to his mouth. Edward was mid-laugh at the head of the table. Mary was adjusting her pearls. The air smelled of expensive roast coffee and premature victory. Melissa! Johnson's voice broke the silence, a mixture of confusion and irritation. He set his glass down, his brow furrowing. Honey, what are you doing here? The spouse's viewing party is downstairs in the atrium. This is a closed session. I didn't answer. I walked past him, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, a shark gliding through deep water. I didn't look at Mary, who was staring at my white suit with open disdain. I didn't look at the nervous bankers clutching their tablets. I walked straight to the head of the table, where Edward sat like a king on his throne. I stood over him. I didn't say a word. I simply waited, my gaze boring into his. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, until Edward, unnerved by the sheer audacity of my presence, cleared his throat and shifted. Melissa, really? Edward grumbled, looking to his son for support. We are minutes away from the bell. You need to leave. I don't think so, I said. My voice was low, devoid of the tremulous soprano they were used to. It was a contralto of command. You are sitting in my chair. Your chair. Johnson laughed, striding over to take my arm. Okay, that's enough. You're stressed. Let's get you a sedative and a driver. I shook off his hand. It wasn't a violent motion, but it was absolute. I walked around the table to the opposite end, the empty seat reserved for the legal counsel, and sat down. I gestured to the door. Mr. Vance entered, silent and grim. He walked around the table, dealing documents to each person like a croupier at a casino where the house had already rigged the wheel. Slap, slap, slap. The sound of the heavy bond paper hitting the polished mahogany was the only noise in the room. Johnson picked up the document in front of him. I watched his face. I watched the blood drain from his cheeks, leaving him the color of wet ash. I watched his eyes dart from the header to the signature, his brain struggling to comprehend the impossibility of the text. Cease and desist order. Immediate injunction against Viridian Essence branding and production. Plaintiff: Melissa Walton, sole proprietor, Grandma's Garden LLC. What is this? Johnson whispered. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a flicker of true fear. Is this a joke? It is a legal notification, I spoke clearly, addressing the room at large. As of 8 a.m. this morning, I have revoked the licensing agreement between Grandma's Garden LLC and this conglomerate. You no longer have the right to manufacture, bottle, market, or sell any product containing my patented formula. You do not own the name Viridian Essence. You do not own the scent. You do not own the process. You're insane, Mary hissed, standing up. We own everything. Johnson merged that little hobby shop years ago. Did he? I asked, arching a brow. Or did he just assume he did? Did he sign the transfer papers, Mary? Or did he sign a waiver of interest 3 weeks ago because he was too busy counting money to read what I put in front of him? I nodded to Vance. He projected a document onto the massive screen at the front of the room, the very screen that was supposed to show the stock soaring. Instead, it displayed the spousal waiver signed by Johnson, notarized and filed with the state. You signed it, Johnson choked out, staring at his own signature on the screen. You tricked me. I didn't trick you, Johnson, I replied, my voice cold. I just let you be yourself. Lazy, arrogant, dismissive. The bankers were frantic now. Phones were being pulled out. The underwriters were whispering furiously. The crown jewel of the IPO, the subsidiary responsible for 60% of the projected growth, had just evaporated. The company they were about to take public was suddenly a hollow shell, a car without an engine. You can't do this, Edward roared, slamming his fist on the table. We go live in 10 minutes. The institutional investors are already queued. You will destroy this family. The family is already destroyed, I said, leaning forward, my hands clasped on the table. You destroyed it when you decided to liquidate me. You thought I was a liability? You thought I was a line item to be erased. I stood up then, the movement drawing every eye in the room. I looked at Johnson, who was gripping the edge of the table as if the floor were opening up beneath him. You built a castle on my land, Johnson, I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. You built your fortune, your reputation, and your future on a foundation that belongs to me. And I am evicting you. The stock. One of the bankers stammered, looking at his tablet. The pre-market rumors are leaking. The institutional buy orders are being pulled. My God, it's crashing before the bell even rings. On the screen, the graph that was supposed to climb was nosediving. Red lines slashed across the display like open wounds. The valuation of the conglomerate was hemorrhaging billions in real time. The phones in the room began to ring, a cacophony of panic. Johnson looked at me. His eyes were wide, glassy with terror. He looked at the woman he had planned to discard, the wife he had mocked, the partner he had betrayed. He saw the white suit. He saw the diamond necklace. He saw the executioner. Melissa, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Please, we can fix this. We can renegotiate. Don't do this. There is nothing to negotiate, I said, picking up my clutch. The license is revoked. The factory lines are stopping as we speak. My grandfather's legacy will not be used to fund your golden parachute. I turned my back on him. I turned my back on the screaming bankers, on the sobbing Mary, on the furious Edward. I walked toward the door, the sound of their world collapsing filling the air behind me. Where are you going? Johnson screamed, a desperate, broken sound. I paused at the door, my hand on the brass handle. I didn't look back. To the bank, I said. I have a deposit to make. In the hours following the boardroom ambush, the stock price of the conglomerate did not merely dip, it cratered. Trading was halted twice by the exchange. A mercy killing for a ticker symbol that was hemorrhaging value with every passing second. But I had not come to burn the village to the ground. Arson is emotional, and I had learned to be transactional. I sat in a private conference room, the chaos of the trading floor muffled by soundproof glass. Across from me sat Edward and Mary, stripped of their gala finery and their arrogance. Johnson was there too, but he was no longer a participant. He sat in the corner, a hollow suit, exiled from the negotiation table by his own parents. They viewed him now not as the heir, but as the incompetence that had cost them their leverage. The terms were simple. I would not destroy Viridian Essence. I would sell it. The patent, the formula, and the brand rights, I said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. For a lump sum payment. Immediate transfer. Edward looked at the figure. His face turned a shade of gray usually reserved for corpses. It was an extortionate number. A sum that would drain their personal liquidity and force them to liquidate significant assets. It was the price of their survival. It was the cost of the castle they had built on my land. This is robbery, Mary whispered, her voice trembling with impotent rage. It is the market rate for saving your legacy. I corrected, my tone devoid of pity. You can buy the engine back or you can watch the car rot. The choice is yours. You have 1 hour before I release a press statement confirming the permanent dissolution of the supply chain. They signed. The strokes of their pens were heavy, angry, and defeated. The transfer of funds was initiated immediately, routed not to a joint account, but to a blind trust in Zurich solely under my control. Then came the second document. The divorce decree. This was not the draft I had found in the safe. This was my version. It granted me the settlement, the clean break, and full immunity from any future litigation. Johnson was summoned to the table like a naughty schoolboy. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He signed his name where Mr. Vance pointed, his hand shaking so violently the ink bled into the paper. It's done, Vance said, closing the briefcase with a definitive snap. I stood up. I didn't offer a handshake. I didn't offer a goodbye. I simply walked out of the room, leaving the three of them amidst the wreckage of their pride. They had their company back, but they had lost their dignity, and a significant portion of their fortune, to the liability they had tried to erase. Returning to the estate for the last time felt like walking through a museum of a past life. The house was silent, the staff making themselves scarce. I packed no suitcases. I took no jewelry, no furs, no tokens of the investment Johnson had made in me. I left the diamond necklace on the dresser. I left the wedding ring beside it. I walked down the grand staircase, my heels clicking on the marble for the final time. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped into the afternoon sun. The air tasted different here, sharper, cleaner. I walked past the luxury sedan Johnson had leased for me and climbed into a waiting taxi. As the iron gate swung open, they didn't feel like a mouth spitting me out. They felt like arms opening to release me. The dower trap had failed. The bird had flown. 30 minutes later, the taxi pulled up to a small, unassuming cafe in the old district. The awning was faded and the tables were wobbly, but the smell of roasted coffee and fresh bread was real. My parents, Walton and Jane, were sitting at a corner table. My father looked better, the color returning to his cheeks. The weight of the looming medical bills lifted. My mother was laughing at something he said, her eyes crinkling in a way I hadn't seen in years. I sat down, sliding into the plastic chair. It was uncomfortable, cheap, and utterly perfect. You're here, Jane said, reaching for my hand. Is it over? I didn't answer immediately. I pulled my phone from my pocket. A notification from the bank sat on the screen. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't a zero balance. It was a confirmation of a wire transfer. The numbers were long, comma-separated, and staggering. It was enough to buy this cafe, the block it sat on, and the hospital where my father was treated. It was freedom distilled into digits. It's over, I said, placing the phone face down on the table. The waiter arrived, a young man with a stained apron and a genuine smile. What can I get for you? I looked at my parents, then at the sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I wasn't Mrs. Johnson anymore. I wasn't a muse. I wasn't a liability. I'll have the coffee, I said, smiling, my voice steady and light. And the check, please. It's on me. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of roasted beans and autonomy. The account was full. The debt was paid. And for the first time in my life, the ledger was balanced in my favor. I honestly didn't see that twist coming with the grandma's garden patent. Face screaming in fear, did you guess that she still owned the formula? Let me know at which part of the story you realized Johnson was in trouble. I'm working hard to bring you more touching and surprising stories like this every week. If you enjoyed this one, please consider subscribing to Mother's Story. Your support helps this channel grow more than you know. Red Heart.